I was reading a report that the new Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice movie had a budget of $400 million. And this is a very troubling number if you understand the film business. When it comes down to films, a film has to make three times its production budget back in order to be considered profitable. And it has to make that three times its production budget back in the United States before it heads to foreign markets in order to be considered a profitable venture by all the investors who invest in it. Now, when you look at Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice's budget, it's $400 million. That means that this film has to make $1.2 billion in the United States. And that's pretty much not possible. I mean, if you do the math, it just doesn't add up. And a lot of Warner Brothers executives on the inside are very scared. And I can understand why they would be very scared because when you look at the film that's supposed to cost $400 million, you don't see the $400 million on screen. And when you look at the clips with the dialogue, it's just not there. So this film is in a lot of trouble. Um, when you look at this film's big picture, it's again a lot of trouble, and the studio is in a lot of trouble because here you have a $400 million film that doesn't look like quality, and it looks like a very very big turkey that could put this studio in the same type of crisis that I think 20th Century Fox was when they made Cleopatra way back in the 1960s. Now, a lot of people don't know about Cleopatra, but I'll tell you, I'll run down the history. Cleopatra was supposed to be this epic movie that starred Elizabeth Taylor back in the 1960s, and the film ran into huge cost overruns. And the film, when they finally completed it, was 6 hours, and they cut it down to 4 hours. But still, the film never made any money. And at the end of its run, the studio pretty much was on the brink of bankruptcy. And this type of huge loss could really not only impact the genre of superhero movies, but movie studios in general. Because I look at the superhero movie and I compare it to what was going on in the late 60s when the Vietnam War was transpiring and people's tastes were changing in film. Now, Hollywood movie studios were still trying to churn out westerns, epic movies, and musicals that had huge budgets. But what happened was people's tastes were changing due to the Vietnam War and the world having a different political view with all of these people. They were out here fighting for civil rights, women's rights, and people wanted different characters and different stories. But the studios weren't able to adapt, and a lot of studios wound up losing a lot of money on many productions, not only Cleopatra, but movies like Tora, and a host of other films. And this could really impact the studio's big picture because they invested heavily in these superhero movies. I mean, the Marvel Studios plan has about 6 or 7 movies on it, and Warner Brothers has a plan for several other superhero movies. And a lot of these movies are in pre production, they have budgets already, and this money is already tied up. So this could be very, very dangerous for the film studios if this movie tanks. A lot of people think that, oh, they'll recover, but a $400 million loss, when you think about it, is a big loss. I mean, even with foreign markets, which is supposed to be gravy for film studios, you still have a big loss when it comes to this type of film if it tanks. Because $400 million is a lot of money to spend, and this may make another studio like Disney start backpedaling on something like Avengers Infinity War, which is speculated to have a $500 million budget. And this is another film that I think is another dangerous sign because you're spending $500 million on a movie, and you would have to make $1.5 billion in order to make your money back, and that's just to break even. What would happen in this case would be another disaster. So they want to. So you would have to make $3 billion before before the on Avengers Infinity War. You'd have to make $3 billion in order to break even, and this is a very very troubling thing that I've seen with superhero movies is that the budgets keep increasing, and this is what killed the musicals and the epic movies and the westerns back in the 60s and the 70s, because the budgets kept increasing, the actors' salaries kept increasing, but the box office kept diminishing. And when it eventually reached a point where the studios were on the brink of bankruptcy and they had to change models because a lot of the audience that came back from the Vietnam War had no interest in seeing singing and dancing or sitting in a 3 hour movie that was an epic or watching some story about the Wild Wild West with shootouts after they just got through, fighting in Vietnam. So they had no interest in watching that type of film. And I think we might be headed for a audience shift when it comes down to the superhero movie in a similar fashion. Kids are getting older, and their taste may change, and that may lead to a really big shift eventually. And yes, you have some successes out here, but this is something, why you don't put all your eggs in one basket or spend all this money on a certain type of film. I mean, $400 million, that's a lot of money. That's an absurd amount of money to spend on a superhero movie. I mean, I remember back in 2002, they only spent $80 million on Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, and they were able to make that up to $400 million. So they made they made a nice profit on that in America, and they made a bigger profit on it in the foreign countries. But with the increasing budgets, you're going to be relying more and more on the foreign markets, and you really don't want to rely too much on outside markets, because that's supposed to be, extra money that you would make after you made the profit on the American business. But when you look at the business models, that they're relying more and more on the foreign markets instead of trying to, make your money in the U.S. and then make your money outside. And this is very dangerous for the film studios' long-term picture, because it's going to break them. I mean, I look at the pattern that I saw with film studios from the 1970s and the late 1960s, and I see that same pattern starting all over again as it relates to these superhero movies and their monster budgets. Because you look at the budgets, they continue to increase, but the profit margin continues to decrease. And when you have a decreasing profit margin, and you have studios relying more and more on superhero movies to pull these profits, and fantasy movies to pull these profits, this is a recipe for disaster. And I don't see anybody with a plan, to help the studios maintain their business by doing something like investing in smaller budget movies, because it was the smaller budget movies that saved the studios. It was them creating the horror genre and creating smaller budget movies like The Godfather, and other films with more human characters that pretty much pulled studios out of bankruptcy. And then later on, they did movies like Saturday Night Fever, Star Wars, and Rocky, which also had smaller budgets. It was those type of films that got Hollywood out of the pit that they were in the 60s. And it looks like they're getting ready to go head right back into this pit, because I look at these superhero movies, and you cannot pull a profit on a $400 million movie. I mean, you have to, again, make $1.2 billion in the U.S. to make that film break even. And then you have to hope that the foreign markets pull in some more. And then I look at down the road at this Infinity War, and I see another disaster coming, because you have to make $3 billion on both films in order to break even. And I don't know if that's possible. I think that I think the superhero genre is headed for the road where Cleopatra went down. And, I'm not the only one who sees this. Director Steven Spielberg sees it. And anybody who has been in the entertainment business looks at these budgets and is saying, when it comes down to superhero movies, yes, it's nice that we're making movies that are true to the source material of these characters, and it's nice that these superheroes are finally getting their spotlight. But there has to be some sort of temperance of discipline when it comes down to the genre, because if the budgets get too big and there aren't any other projects out there, this whole genre could pretty much bankrupt the film studios and send them headed back down the road where they're on the brink of collapse. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.